What if I told you that the single most celebrated royal birth of the last decade, the arrival of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, might not have happened the way the world was led to believe? Imagine the headlines. Imagine the shock. Imagine the betrayal. Because according to a doctor who has now come forward, Meghan Markle's name was never even listed in the official admission records of the hospital where she supposedly gave birth. Let that sink in for a moment. How does a woman, under the most intense public scrutiny, give birth to a royal baby and yet leave no trace in the paperwork that should have documented every detail? This is not just a small oversight. This is not a missing page in an otherwise tidy file. This is the absence of a mother's name, the core piece of evidence that would confirm she was ever admitted. And if she wasn't, then who gave birth to Archie? Why were medical records sealed, altered, or perhaps never filed correctly in the first place? Was this a carefully choreographed illusion meant to protect a truth too controversial for the world to handle? And if so, what was so explosive that it had to be hidden behind walls of secrecy and layers of legal agreements? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The royal family thrives on tradition. It thrives on appearances. It thrives on trust. The idea that what the public sees is, at least in some part, grounded in truth. But what happens when that trust is shattered? When evidence starts to suggest that the biggest event of Harry and Meghan's marriage, the birth of their son, was orchestrated in a way no one could have imagined. Let's pause here. Picture the frenzy on the day Archie was born. Reporters camping outside. Fans refreshing news feeds. Broadcasters speculating every second. This was not just another celebrity baby announcement. This was the birth of a child who, by bloodline, carried both the legacy of the House of Windsor and the novelty of a mixed-race royal. It was historic. It was symbolic. It was powerful. Every camera was pointed toward Meghan. Every headline awaited confirmation. But behind the spectacle, a different story might have been unfolding. A story that begins with a missing name on a hospital form. A name that should have been written in ink, logged, and archived forever in medical records. The absence of that name is more than suspicious. It's damning. It suggests that Meghan herself may not have been the one who went through the physical ordeal of childbirth that day. Instead, whispers point toward a surrogate, an arrangement shrouded in confidentiality agreements so airtight that even seasoned royal staff couldn't speak of it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Could this really be true? Would Harry and Meghan dare to mislead the world about something as sacred as the birth of their child? It sounds unthinkable, doesn't it? But history is littered with unthinkable scandals. Royal families, governments, Hollywood elites, all have mastered the art of the cover-up when reputations, power, and money are at stake. And in this case, the stakes could not have been higher. But why now? Why is this revelation surfacing in 2025, years after Archie's birth? Because time has a funny way of loosening lips. Staff retire. Doctors step away. Legal contracts expire. And those who were once silenced by fear or loyalty begin to feel the weight of truth pressing against their conscience. This doctor, the one who claims Meghan's name never appeared in the admission records, may very well be one of those people. And his testimony could crack open a secret that Harry and Meghan have fought desperately to keep sealed. Think about this. Hospitals don't simply forget to log patients, especially high-profile ones. If anything, royal births are over-documented. Every signature, every witness, every nurse on duty, it's all accounted for. So for Meghan's name to be missing, it's not negligence. It's intent. Someone wanted her absent from those records. Someone wanted the world to believe she was there when she wasn't. And the only reason to do that is if someone else was giving birth in her place. The implications of surrogacy in this context are massive. On a personal level, there's nothing wrong with surrogacy. It's a legitimate, often beautiful arrangement for families who cannot conceive naturally. But in the context of royalty, where lineage, bloodline, and appearance are everything, the secrecy becomes the scandal. If Archie was born via a surrogate, then why hide it? Why not embrace transparency? Why not tell the world, we chose this path for our family? The answer lies in the monarchy's obsession with image, the Sussexes' obsession with control, and a truth that could have altered public perception of Meghan forever. And here's where the story takes its most sinister turn. Medical records were not just sealed. According to this insider, they may have been altered under pressure from Harry and Meghan themselves. Staff were allegedly coerced, persuaded, or outright bullied into ensuring that nothing compromising ever reached the public. Imagine being a nurse or a records clerk, suddenly confronted by royal representatives demanding you change official documents. The weight of that pressure, the fear of losing your career, the knowledge that if you spoke out, you'd be blacklisted, silenced, or worse. But why would they go to such lengths? Why not simply say nothing? Because silence can be suspicious. In an age of leaks and investigative journalists, silence is a vacuum that invites curiosity. No, they needed a paper trail. They needed a narrative. And if that meant editing files, sealing records, and swearing staff to secrecy, then so be it. The public would never know. Or so they thought. And here's the kicker. The more you examine the timeline, the more cracks appear. The staged photos, the awkward press statements, the way Meghan seemed to vanish from public view during her supposed late pregnancy, only to reappear looking remarkably composed for a new mother. Have you ever noticed how little authentic, candid footage exists of Meghan during those crucial days? Almost as if the palace, the Sussexes, and the press were all complicit in keeping the lens pointed away at the right moments. So ask yourself, if this was all perfectly above board, why hide anything? Why seal records? Why enforce NDAs? Why silence staff? The only reason to build such a fortress of secrecy is because the truth, if revealed, would shatter everything. And that's why this doctor's revelation is not just another royal rumor. It's a ticking time bomb. If Meghan's name never appeared in the hospital's admission records, then the official story of Archie's birth collapses. It means the palace lied. It means Harry and Meghan lied. It means the world has been celebrating an illusion. But here's the thing. This is only the beginning. Because the doctor didn't just reveal the missing name. He hinted at the existence of documents, sealed under confidentiality agreements, that could expose the entire surrogacy arrangement. Documents that may have been altered, rewritten, or buried. And if those documents ever see the light of day, the scandal will make every royal controversy before it look like child's play. Which brings us to the question, how deep does this deception go? Were other senior royals aware? Was Buckingham Palace complicit? Or was this entirely orchestrated by Harry and Meghan? Were taxpayers misled? And what about Archie himself? What does this mean for his future, his identity, and his place in royal history? Because the more you dig, the more you realize this isn't just a story about a missing name in a hospital file. It's about power. It's about image. It's about the lengths people will go to control a narrative when billions of eyes are watching. And the truth? The truth may be stranger, darker, and more calculated than anyone dared to imagine. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The morning of May 6, 2019, was anything but ordinary. The world woke up buzzing with anticipation. Every news channel, every tabloid, every online feed was alive with one question. Had Meghan Markle finally given birth to the long-awaited royal baby? The tension was electric. Paparazzi crowded the streets. Reporters rehearsed their breaking news segments. Fans camped outside Windsor, clutching Union Jacks and homemade signs. It was supposed to be one of the most joyous, transparent moments in modern royal history. But behind the glittering headlines, something was quietly brewing, something no one in that cheering crowd could have imagined. Because while the cameras pointed one way, the truth was playing out somewhere else. Staff at the hospital, those who should have been on high alert for Meghan's arrival, weren't seeing what they expected. No convoys rushed in. No royal motorcades with tinted windows. No heavily pregnant duchess being ushered inside by doctors and security. Instead, a strange calm lingered. And as hours turned into minutes before the official announcement, whispers began circulating among the medical staff. She's not here. Now pause for a moment and think about this. A royal birth isn't a casual affair. It's not like a celebrity sneaking into Cedars-Sinai under an alias. No, royal births are events of record. Every protocol is precise. Every entry in the hospital log is scrutinized. Nurses are briefed. Security is heightened. Everything is documented. So how is it that, on the day of Archie's birth, Meghan's name was nowhere to be found? Let's rewind. In the weeks leading up to May 6th, Meghan's pregnancy had been the subject of global fascination. Every public appearance was analyzed. Was she glowing? Was the bump too high? Too low? Too perfect? The speculation bordered on obsession. Yet strangely, Meghan disappeared from the public eye in those final crucial weeks. Unlike Kate Middleton, who was photographed leaving the hospital within hours of delivery, Meghan chose secrecy. There were no steps outside the Lindo wing. No smiling baby reveal with flashing cameras. Instead, the palace announced that Meghan had gone into labor hours after she had already, supposedly, delivered. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Eyewitnesses that day reported confusion. Some journalists stationed outside the Portland hospital claimed they saw nothing unusual. No sign of Meghan entering, no rush of medical staff. Others suggested that the couple might have been at Frogmore Cottage, only to later be transported discreetly. The inconsistencies piled up, creating an atmosphere thick with unanswered questions. And then came the official statement. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born at 5:26 a.m. The announcement hit the airwaves, sparking celebration worldwide. But here's the twist. The news didn't come directly from the hospital, as one might expect. It came through palace channels, crafted and timed for maximum control. Hours had passed between the supposed birth and the announcement. In that gap, something had happened. Something carefully orchestrated. Now, think about the doctors. In any other royal birth, the attending physicians proudly put their names on the certificate. They serve as witnesses to history. But in Archie's case, the details were shrouded in unusual secrecy. The official birth certificate listed Portland Hospital. Yes, but the surrounding paperwork? Oddly minimal. No fanfare from the hospital staff. No photographs of doctors or nurses smiling with pride. Just silence. And silence, in this context, speaks volumes. One doctor later hinted that Meghan's name never appeared in the admission records that morning. To be clear, this wasn't a clerical error. Hospitals don't make mistakes when dealing with royalty. Every royal patient gets a red carpet treatment of sorts. Their name is logged, secured, and archived for future generations to study. The absence of Meghan's name is not an accident. It's an erasure. But erased for what reason? That's where the whispers of surrogacy begin to sound less like wild conspiracy and more like the only logical explanation. Because if Meghan wasn't physically there, if she never signed into the hospital, then who was the woman inside that delivery room? And here's the thing. The palace didn't exactly help themselves. Their handling of the announcement was clumsy at best, suspicious at worst. Harry gave an awkward interview outside Windsor Castle later that day, visibly flustered, almost rehearsed. He seemed excited, of course, but also strangely vague. He didn't mention details one might expect from a proud new father, like the labor, Meghan's bravery, or the baby's first cry. Instead, he stuck to broad strokes, carefully avoiding specifics, almost as if he had been told what to say and what not to. Let's not forget the photographs. Days later, when Archie was first shown to the world, Meghan appeared surprisingly polished. Her figure, her composure, her calm demeanor. Did it look like a woman who had just gone through labor? Many mothers watching from home thought not. They remembered their own exhaustion, their own recovery, their own raw vulnerability after childbirth. Meghan's presentation was immaculate, almost too immaculate. Was it a miracle of genetics, or the absence of labor altogether? This disconnect between image and reality widened the cracks in the official narrative. The public saw one thing. The records suggested another. And the insiders knew the truth. That Meghan was never officially admitted that day. Ask yourself, if the birth was truly straightforward, why the secrecy? Why not show Meghan entering the hospital? Why not release a statement the moment she went into labor, like with Kate? Why wait until after the supposed birth, when the narrative could be tightly controlled? The answer is unsettling, because the story needed to be managed. And this wasn't the first time the palace had played games with the press. Royal births have always been steeped in ceremony, but also in control. However, the degree of secrecy around Archie's birth was unprecedented. For some, it was proof that Harry and Meghan were simply modernizing, choosing privacy over spectacle. But for others, especially now, with the doctor's testimony, the secrecy reads like a cover-up. And if this was a cover-up, then the missing name in the admission records is the first breadcrumb in a trail that leads somewhere much darker. Because Meghan's absence that day isn't just about her. It's about what she and Harry wanted the world to believe, and the lengths they were willing to go to protect that illusion. It's about the silence of staff, the sealed records, the ironclad confidentiality agreements. It's about power, manipulation, and the rewriting of history in real time. And when one brave doctor chose to speak out, the carefully crafted facade began to unravel. But if Meghan's name wasn't on the admission records, then whose was? Who walked through those hospital doors, under heavy secrecy, and gave birth in her place? The answer to that question doesn't just rewrite Archie's story, it rewrites the royal narrative itself. And what replaced her name in those files will shock you even more. Imagine for a moment being the person in charge of the admissions desk at Portland Hospital on that fateful morning in May 2019. The pressure would have been immense. A royal birth isn't an everyday occurrence. It's a once-in-a-lifetime event that every hospital staff member knows will be etched into history. The procedures are drilled. The security is heightened. The names, the names, are treated like treasures. Every document, every log, every keystroke must be exact, permanent, indisputable. And yet, when the dust settled and curious eyes peered into those records, one name was conspicuously absent. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, the woman who the world was told went into labor and delivered Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor. The name that should have been typed into the system, highlighted, double-checked, and triple-archived for future historians to marvel at. It wasn't there. Pause and consider how impossible that sounds. Hospitals don't just forget to log patients, especially not high-profile patients, and absolutely not a royal mother-to-be whose every movement had been tracked by the global media for months. When a member of the royal family is admitted, it isn't just recorded, it's over-recorded. The detail is microscopic. Who attended them? When they arrived? Which room they occupied? What staff were present? All of it is meticulously documented. That's protocol. That's history. That's duty. So when Meghan's name failed to appear on those official records, the only logical conclusion is this: it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Let's peel back the layers. First, think about what those admission records represent. They aren't just bureaucratic paperwork. They're legal, medical, and historical evidence. They're the receipts, the proof, the backbone of credibility. Without them, the story collapses. Without them, the birth certificate is just ink on paper. Without them, the official narrative becomes nothing more than a carefully polished press release. Second, think about the context. At the very moment the palace was announcing that Meghan had gone into labor, medical staff were allegedly baffled. Some claimed there was no flurry of royal activity inside the hospital. No security teams barricading hallways. No Duchess in distress being wheeled into delivery. Just business as usual. The contrast between what the palace said and what was happening on the ground couldn't have been sharper. And yet, hours later, Meghan and Harry announced their joyous news to the world. A healthy baby boy. Smiles all around. But when investigators, journalists, and insiders tried to confirm the details, the trail led to a brick wall. No hospital records. No admission under Meghan's name. Just silence. Now let me ask you directly. Doesn't that silence feel deafening? Doesn't it raise more questions than it answers? Some skeptics might say, well, perhaps her name was hidden for privacy. Perhaps it was coded or replaced with an alias. And yes, that's a possibility. Celebrities often use pseudonyms in hospitals. But here's the problem. Aliases still leave a paper trail. There's still a record, a placeholder, a system entry. Doctors and nurses still need to know who they're treating, even if the public doesn't. So if Meghan's name, or any believable alias, doesn't exist in the records, then who exactly was the patient that morning? That question takes us straight into the heart of the scandal. Because according to one doctor, the name that should have been there was replaced. Replaced not with an alias for Meghan, but with something else, something deliberately vague, something designed to obscure the truth rather than protect it. Why? To conceal the involvement of a surrogate. Think about it. If Meghan had truly delivered Archie, there'd be no reason to hide her admission. The public expected her to give birth. The press was ready for it. There was nothing controversial about her delivering her child. But if someone else was carrying Archie, if a surrogate was the one admitted, under a different name, protected by confidentiality agreements, then suddenly the missing records make sense. Suddenly, the silence is no longer baffling. It's incriminating. This isn't about privacy. This is about deception. And the deception was layered, subtle, meticulous. The palace knew they couldn't simply avoid the hospital entirely. They needed to anchor the story somewhere, to point to Portland Hospital as the official site of birth. That way, when people asked questions, there was at least a location to gesture toward. But they also knew they couldn't allow the real truth to seep out. The surrogate's identity, the paperwork trail, the medical staff who witnessed it all. So they sealed the records. Or worse, they altered them. Imagine the conversations behind those doors. Lawyers drafting airtight NDAs. Administrators warned of the consequences if a single detail leaked. Clerks nudged to adjust the database. Doctors pressured to play along. Nurses silenced. The weight of the crown pressing down on ordinary people whose careers, reputations, and livelihoods could be destroyed if they refused to comply. Now ask yourself this. What kind of truth needs that level of protection? Because if Meghan had given birth in the usual way, none of this would be necessary. Privacy, yes. Discretion, of course. But not this suffocating secrecy. Not the absence of her name in the very records that should prove her presence. And here's the irony. This attempt to conceal the truth only fueled suspicion. Every gap in the story became a chasm. Every unanswered question became a scandal in waiting. The absence of Meghan's name didn't silence curiosity. It amplified it. It made the whispers of surrogacy louder, the rumors harder to dismiss. Let's not forget the symbolism here. The admission records aren't just about Meghan. They're about Archie's very identity. They're about legitimacy, lineage, and history. Generations from now, historians will want to examine those records to understand how this chapter of the monarchy unfolded. But what will they find? A blank space where Meghan's name should have been? A sealed file that refuses to be opened? An altered entry designed to mislead? And if the foundation of Archie's birth story is built on missing or falsified paperwork, then what else in this saga has been manipulated? Because the doctor who revealed this gap didn't stop there. He hinted that the story goes deeper, that the missing admission records were only the first piece of the puzzle, that the real evidence lies in sealed files, confidentiality agreements, and altered medical notes, that the palace didn't just erase Meghan's name, they actively rewrote history. But if Meghan's name wasn't there, then whose was? Which identity was logged in her place? And what does that mean for Archie's origin story, for the monarchy, and for the trust of an entire nation? Because the missing records aren't just a mystery. They're a warning, a sign that the truth we've been fed is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. And what replaced her name in those files will shock you even more. The whistle of truth rarely comes from the grand halls of power. It almost always slips out from the corners, from those who were there, from those who saw too much, from those whose conscience weighs heavier than their fear. And in this case, it came from a doctor who was there, a doctor who saw the paperwork, a doctor who has now broken the silence to confirm what so many suspected but could never prove. Meghan's name was not on the admission records the day Archie was born. Picture the scene for a moment. It's early morning. The corridors of Portland Hospital are calm but tense. Staff have been briefed for weeks. Everyone knows a royal baby is expected. Security is supposed to be tight. Protocols should be followed to the letter. But instead of a duchess being ushered in, something unusual unfolds. A different patient is admitted, quietly, discreetly, under a name few would recognize. And that's where the secrecy begins. This doctor remembers the unease. He recalls how strange it felt that no senior medical official mentioned Meghan directly. He remembers whispers among nurses that the patient wasn't who the press would think. And above all, he remembers the silence in the logs where her name should have been. A blank space, a void, an omission that was as loud as a scream. Now, before we go further, let's ask the obvious question. Why would a doctor risk speaking out? Why jeopardize their career, their reputation, their safety, even years later? The answer is simple, because some truths gnaw at the soul. Because living with a lie this big, a lie that distorts history itself, is unbearable. And so, when approached, this doctor spoke. Not with wild claims, not with speculation, but with cold, clinical clarity. He confirmed what many insiders had whispered in private. Meghan Markle never officially passed through those doors as a patient. She never registered under her own name. And more than that, staff were bound by confidentiality agreements so strict that even uttering her name in the wrong context could have ended their careers. But why such intensity? Why would doctors and nurses, whose job it is to record, to document, to preserve the truth, be gagged into silence? The answer lies in the arrangements behind the scenes. According to this insider, surrogacy was at the center of it all. And unlike the open, celebrated surrogacy journeys of celebrities and public figures, this one was cloaked in secrecy. Every paper trail, every signature, every file had to be hidden. The doctor describes the atmosphere as suffocating. Lawyers circulated the halls more than midwives. Conversations were cut short the moment outsiders entered a room. Even among colleagues, there was a sense that everyone was watching each other, waiting to see who might slip, who might ask too many questions. It wasn't just medicine being practiced that day, it was theater. Carefully directed, tightly scripted theater. Now think about this. For centuries, royal births have been public events. Not public in the sense of cameras in the delivery room, but public in accountability. Witnesses were traditionally required to confirm that heirs were legitimately born of their mothers. In the past, archbishops, officials, even courtiers would be present to ensure no switch, no deception. That tradition faded in modern times, but the principle remained: transparency. Yet in Meghan's case, the pendulum swung to the opposite extreme. Instead of transparency, there was opacity. Instead of witnesses, there were silent staff. Instead of proof, there were rumors. This doctor, bound for years by silence, finally admitted what many suspected: that the secrecy was unnatural, that the NDAs were not standard, that the editing of medical records was not just unusual, it was unprecedented, and that the pressure didn't come from random hospital administrators. It came from Harry and Meghan's team directly, representatives who made it clear that nothing, absolutely nothing, could contradict the official narrative being crafted for the public. And here's where it gets even darker. According to the doctor, there were files. Files that once contained details of the patient who actually gave birth. Those files, he says, were sealed so tightly that even senior staff couldn't access them. Some entries were allegedly altered, dates shifted, names redacted. The result? A Frankenstein record that bore little resemblance to the truth. Think about what that means. Medical professionals, sworn to uphold integrity, were cornered into complicity. The historical record, which future generations will rely on, was deliberately tampered with. And the world was fed a version of events polished to perfection by PR strategists, not written honestly by doctors. Now, you might be wondering, couldn't the hospital itself have refused? Couldn't the administrators have said no to this pressure? In theory, yes. But in practice, this was royalty. This was power colliding with reputation. Hospitals are businesses as much as they are institutions of care. The prestige of being associated with a royal birth was immense. The risk of losing that relationship, of being branded untrustworthy, was even greater. And so the machinery of complicity turned. Silence was purchased. Cooperation was enforced. And here's the irony. The very act of hiding the truth may have been what doomed them. Because secrecy breeds suspicion. The missing name on the admission records wasn't a loose thread, it was a spotlight. And when people like this doctor saw the spotlight, they couldn't unsee it. Let's pause and ask the audience directly. If this was all above board, why silence staff? Why alter files? Why erase names? If Meghan had truly given birth that morning, wouldn't the records proudly display it? Wouldn't the doctors stand tall, ready to confirm their role in history? The absence of her name doesn't just suggest secrecy. It screams it. And this doctor knew that one day, the truth would seep out. He didn't know when. He didn't know how. But he knew history couldn't be rewritten forever. Which is why his testimony matters so much now. It isn't the rantings of a disgruntled employee. It's the reluctant truth of a professional who could no longer carry the weight of a lie. But his revelations don't end there. Because when pressed about why such drastic secrecy was enforced, his answer pointed squarely at one explanation. An explanation so explosive that even he hesitated to say it aloud. That Archie was not born of Meghan herself, but via a surrogate. And that every sealed record, every altered file, every pressured nurse was part of an elaborate plan to conceal that fact. And if that's true, then the missing admission records weren't just a clerical oddity. They were the keystone of a cover-up that stretched from the hospital halls to the palace gates. Which begs the question, if surrogacy was used, why didn't Meghan and Harry simply admit it? Why didn't they choose honesty? The answer may lie in tradition, image, and a monarchy terrified of scandal. But as this doctor made clear, the cover-up itself has now become the bigger scandal. Because secrets like this don't stay buried forever. They haunt. They leak. They demand to be heard. And this was only the first whisper. But the doctor's revelation was just the beginning. Because the moment he confirmed the truth about those records, a larger question came crashing to the surface. How does surrogacy fit into the centuries-old legacy of royal births? And that's where the story takes a turn into history, tradition, and a scandal that stretches far beyond Meghan and Harry. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Surrogacy. A word that sparks debate, ignites emotion, and divides opinion. In Hollywood, it's become almost normalized. Stars like Kim Kardashian, Priyanka Chopra, and Sarah Jessica Parker have openly shared their surrogacy journeys, celebrating it as a modern solution for growing families. But in the centuries-old institution of royalty, the very idea collides head-on with tradition, secrecy, and an obsession with lineage so rigid that even whispers of surrogacy are treated like poison. So when the doctor revealed that Meghan's name was missing from the admission records and speculation pointed toward a surrogate arrangement, it wasn't just about Meghan and Harry. It touched on something much deeper, a historical taboo that royal families across Europe have danced around, concealed, or outright denied for generations. Let's rewind. For centuries, the legitimacy of heirs has been the lifeblood of monarchies. Bloodlines are everything. The right to the throne depends on an unbroken, verifiable chain of parentage. That's why in earlier times, births of royal heirs weren't private affairs. Witnesses, sometimes entire councils, were required to be present in the delivery chamber. Imagine that, a queen giving birth with high-ranking officials literally standing by, ensuring no substitution, no scandal, no doubt about who the child belonged to. This wasn't cruelty. This was monarchy's obsession with legitimacy. But as times changed, traditions relaxed. By the 20th century, royals were allowed privacy during childbirth. Yet the principle of transparency lingered. There was still an expectation that royal births be documented beyond dispute, which is why the secrecy around Archie's birth feels so out of step with history. But here's the twist. Whispers of surrogacy in royal circles aren't new. They've existed for decades, sometimes centuries, hidden in shadows, passed along like dangerous gossip. The Spanish court, the Russian court, even within the British royal family itself, there have been unconfirmed murmurs of arrangements when heirs were difficult to conceive. None of it has ever been officially acknowledged, because to do so would undermine the illusion of perfection. Think about the monarchy's obsession with image. A surrogate birth, while medically and ethically legitimate, clashes with the storybook fantasy they sell to the world, a glowing royal mother, cradling her newborn, embodying both tradition and continuity. Surrogacy doesn't fit that fairy tale. It disrupts it. And for an institution that depends on myth, disruption is dangerous. Now let's bring Meghan back into the picture. She was not just any royal wife. She was already seen as a disruptor, an American, a divorcee, a biracial woman entering an ancient, predominantly white institution. She was branded modern, but also controversial. Every move she made was scrutinized. Every step was politicized. If it had been revealed that Meghan used a surrogate to deliver Archie, the backlash would have been volcanic. Critics would have spun it as fraud. Traditionalists would have declared Archie's place in the line of succession illegitimate. The monarchy would have faced a legitimacy crisis unlike anything in recent memory. And here lies the cruel irony. Surrogacy itself isn't scandalous. It's secrecy that makes it scandalous. If Meghan and Harry had stood before the world and said, "We chose this path, and we're proud of it," the conversation might have been uncomfortable, yes, but it would have been honest. Instead, they allegedly chose concealment. And concealment is where history turns to scandal. Let's not forget, Meghan herself had made motherhood central to her image. The glowing bump, the carefully posed photographs, the interviews filled with anticipation. It was all part of the narrative. And if that bump wasn't real, or at least not the whole truth, then the performance becomes deception. And deception, in the context of royalty, is unforgivable. Now, let's zoom out again. Across Europe, royals have faced fertility challenges for centuries. It's whispered that some princesses, unable to conceive, relied on quiet arrangements to secure heirs. In some cases, adoption was disguised as birth. In others, surrogates were allegedly brought in under absolute secrecy, their roles buried so deep no one dared speak of them. But in the modern world of smartphones, paparazzi, and relentless media, such secrets are far harder to contain. Which is why the alleged surrogacy behind Archie's birth feels like an old royal trick trying, and failing, to survive in a new era. The secrecy is also why the doctor's testimony is so explosive. It doesn't just hint at Meghan's absence from the hospital. It exposes a continuity of deception, a pattern of cover-ups that tie the modern monarchy to its scandal-ridden past. The missing name in the records isn't just about Meghan. It's about a royal institution that has always chosen illusion over truth, tradition over transparency. Ask yourself, why did earlier monarchs insist on witnesses at royal births? Because they knew the temptation to deceive was always there. They knew image could never outweigh proof. Yet in Archie's case, the tradition of witnesses was abandoned, and in its place, NDAs, legal contracts, sealed files. If that isn't proof of history repeating itself, what is? Let me put it to you directly. Do you think the monarchy could survive if it openly admitted to hiding a surrogate birth? Could it weather the storm of questions about Archie's legitimacy, about Meghan's role, about Harry's complicity? Or would it collapse under the weight of betrayal? And then consider this. If surrogacy was indeed used, who else knew? Was Buckingham Palace informed? Was the Queen told? Did senior courtiers participate in orchestrating the secrecy? Or was this entirely a Sussex operation, driven by Meghan and Harry's desire to control the narrative? Because if palace officials were involved, then this isn't just Meghan's scandal. It's the monarchy scandal, a deception that reaches the very heart of the institution. And that's where this story grows darker still. Because the deeper you look into the idea of surrogacy in royal history, the clearer it becomes that the truth has always been too dangerous to acknowledge. Which is why every shred of evidence was locked away. Which is why every staff member was silenced. Which is why Meghan's name was missing from those records. But here's the catch. Secrets don't stay buried. Not forever. And the whispers about surrogacy in Archie's birth are no longer whispers. They're testimonies. They're leaks. They're cracks in a wall that is starting to crumble. And that's why the doctor's revelation matters so much. Because he hasn't just pulled back the curtain on Meghan. He's pulled back the curtain on history. But if the use of a surrogate was really at the heart of this scandal, the question becomes, how did they hide it so well? What mechanisms were put in place to ensure that the truth never reached the public? The answer lies in the next part of the puzzle. Confidentiality agreements so airtight, so unforgiving, that even the bravest staff thought twice before speaking. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Confidentiality. A word that sounds clinical, even harmless. But in the world of power, it becomes a weapon. When wielded correctly, it can silence an entire room. It can bind doctors, nurses, assistants, and administrators into chains stronger than steel. And on the day of Archie's supposed birth, confidentiality wasn't just encouraged. It was enforced with a ferocity that left hospital staff shaken, fearful, and bound to secrecy that extended far beyond their medical duties. Let's start here. NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements, are not unusual in high-profile medical cases. Celebrities use them all the time. But in this case, the confidentiality agreements were not ordinary. According to insiders, they were extraordinary. More detailed, more restrictive, more punitive. Staff weren't just told to keep details private. They were explicitly warned that a single slip, even an innocent remark, could cost them their careers, their livelihoods, even their freedom. One nurse described the atmosphere as suffocating. She said it felt less like working in a hospital and more like participating in a covert operation. Every conversation was monitored. Every document was double-checked. Even casual chatter among staff was policed, as though the walls themselves had ears. Imagine going about your work, a job you trained your entire life to do, only to find that your medical expertise mattered less than your silence. That's what these NDAs did. They turned professionals into prisoners. Now pause and ask yourself, why? Why would Harry and Meghan, or those representing them, insist on such extreme secrecy? If Meghan had truly given birth in that hospital bed, why not allow the usual discretion of staff? Why go further, creating an environment of fear? The only reason to demand such ironclad silence is because there was something to hide, something explosive. And here's where the story grows even darker. These agreements weren't just hospital-issued. They were allegedly drafted and reinforced by outside legal teams connected to the Sussexes themselves. Lawyers who were not affiliated with the hospital were seen circulating, reminding staff of the penalties for noncompliance. That detail matters, because it means this wasn't just a hospital policy, it was a personal operation. Harry and Meghan's camp took no chances. They wanted total control. Consider the implications. Staff who may have witnessed the true events, the arrival of a surrogate, the sealing of records, the altering of medical files, were effectively muzzled. Even years later, those agreements cast a long shadow. Breaking them could mean lawsuits, public ruin, financial devastation. Which is why so few voices have emerged. Which is why the doctor who spoke out did so cautiously, carefully, and only once he believed enough time had passed that the truth had to come forward. Now let's add another layer. Confidentiality agreements usually serve one purpose: to protect privacy. But these agreements went beyond privacy. They demanded complicity. Staff were not only told to keep quiet, they were required to actively support the official story, to treat Meghan as though she had been present, to avoid even acknowledging the surrogate's existence, to sign off on altered documents that preserved the illusion. In essence, they weren't just told to stay silent. They were told to participate in a cover-up. This brings us to a painful irony. Medical professionals take oaths to protect patients, to honor truth, to preserve life. Yet on that day, they were compelled to break that oath, not for medical reasons, but for political and personal ones. They weren't protecting Meghan's privacy. They were protecting a narrative. And protecting that narrative meant silencing themselves, burying their integrity under contracts designed to shield a lie. Imagine the weight of that decision. Imagine being a midwife told not to record the truth. Imagine being a nurse told to look the other way as files were altered. Imagine being a doctor forced to balance professional ethics against the crushing pressure of royal power. For some, the decision was survival. For others, it was betrayal. And the fear didn't stop at the hospital doors. Even after Archie's birth was announced, the NDAs continued to loom. Staff were reminded not to talk, not to speculate, not to share even the smallest detail with friends or family. Some insiders later admitted they felt like hostages to a secret they never asked to be part of. Now, let me ask you, what kind of truth requires this level of silence? What kind of truth is so dangerous that staff must be legally threatened into compliance? Because if Meghan had truly given birth, there'd be no need for such sweeping gag orders. Privacy, yes, but fear? Coercion? Silence that extends for years? That only makes sense if the truth, if revealed, would cause irreparable damage. And that truth, as the doctor revealed, was that a surrogate was involved, that the missing records were no accident, that the secrecy wasn't about privacy, it was about rewriting history. But here's the most chilling part. These agreements didn't just silence staff. They erased accountability. If anyone ever came forward, their credibility could be destroyed with a single accusation: breach of contract. That's the brilliance and the cruelty of NDAs. They don't just silence. They discredit. Even the truth, spoken aloud, becomes suspect when spoken by someone bound to secrecy. And so, the official story stood unchallenged for years. Meghan gave birth. Archie was born at Portland Hospital. All was well. All was normal. All was recorded in the glossy press releases and photographs. But behind the curtain, silence reigned. Until now. Because one doctor decided the truth mattered more than fear. One doctor chose to risk the wrath of legal teams, the judgment of peers, the scorn of an institution built on image, to say what others would not. That Meghan's name was missing. That records were sealed. That confidentiality agreements were weaponized. And that decision, to speak, has cracked the facade wide open. But as damning as those NDAs were, they were only one piece of the puzzle. Because what they were protecting wasn't just the absence of Meghan's name. It was the identity of the person who truly gave birth to Archie, the surrogate whose presence was hidden, erased, and silenced. And once you hear how that arrangement was concealed, and how far Harry and Meghan allegedly went to preserve it, you'll understand just how deep this cover-up really ran. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The word surrogate has the power to ignite emotions. Hope for some, scandal for others. In Hollywood, it's a badge of honesty, even empowerment. But within the walls of monarchy, it becomes something else entirely, a dangerous secret. And if the missing hospital records, sealed files, and suffocating confidentiality agreements all point toward one truth, it's this. The baby the world welcomed as Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was not delivered by Meghan Markle herself, but by another woman hidden in plain sight. Let's take a step back and imagine the planning. Surrogacy doesn't happen overnight. It requires months, sometimes years, of preparation. Medical arrangements, legal contracts, counseling, payments. And when it involves royalty, secrecy on a level so extreme that every participant must sign their life away. If Archie was born via surrogate, then Harry and Meghan had been orchestrating this arrangement long before the world saw Meghan's baby bump. Now picture this. Somewhere in London, or perhaps even beyond, a woman was chosen. Her identity was vetted, protected, buried under paperwork. She wasn't just anyone. She had to be healthy, discreet, and most importantly, willing to vanish from the story once her role was complete. From the moment she signed the contract, her life wasn't her own. Every appointment was monitored, every movement shielded from public eyes. She wasn't carrying just a baby. She was carrying the future of the monarchy, cloaked in silence. And here's where the story tightens like a noose. While the surrogate's pregnancy advanced behind closed doors, Meghan's public appearances became the stage. The designer dresses, the carefully cradled bump, the photo ops that sparked both admiration and suspicion. For some, Meghan's bump seemed to change shape overnight. For others, her ease of movement late in pregnancy raised eyebrows. Rumors of a moon bump, a prosthetic belly, circulated online. At the time, these theories were dismissed as cruel conspiracies. But in light of the doctor's revelation, they take on a chilling new resonance. Ask yourself, why would Meghan go to such lengths to present herself as pregnant if she wasn't? The answer lies in control. The image of a glowing mother-to-be was central to her narrative. It softened criticism. It generated sympathy. It secured her place in the royal spotlight. And most importantly, it cemented Archie's legitimacy in the eyes of the public. Without the bump, without the staged appearances, suspicion would have bloomed long before his birth. Now, let's talk about the surrogate's experience. Insiders suggest she never set foot in the same spotlight Meghan basked in. Her hospital admission was discreet, quiet, perhaps under an alias. She may have delivered in the very same Portland hospital that the palace announced, but she wasn't celebrated. She wasn't photographed leaving with flowers and congratulations. She was whisked away, her role erased. The moment Archie entered the world, her existence in the narrative ended. But the medical staff knew. They saw. They documented. And that's why those files had to be sealed. That's why NDAs were issued like chains. That's why Meghan's name was missing, because someone else's name was there, and that someone couldn't be allowed to exist in the official story. Let's consider the emotional dimension. Surrogacy is not shameful. For countless families, it's an act of love. But secrecy changes everything. The surrogate wasn't acknowledged. Meghan wasn't transparent. Instead, a fiction was crafted. And fiction, when propped up by altered records and pressured staff, becomes deception. But deception isn't just about hiding facts. It's about creating illusions. Think of the photographs released days after Archie's birth. Meghan and Harry, radiant, presenting their baby to the world in St. George's Hall. Meghan's body looked untouched by the pain of labor. Her smile was serene, her posture effortless. Mothers everywhere raised eyebrows. How, they asked. How does she look like that just days after giving birth? The palace brushed off the skepticism. But now, knowing what we know, the answer seems obvious. She hadn't given birth at all. And here's where the surrogate arrangement collides with the monarchy's obsession with tradition. If Archie was born of another woman, it challenges not just Meghan's story, but the very foundation of royal legitimacy. Bloodline matters. Birthright matters. And while Archie would still carry Harry's DNA, Meghan's absence from the birth challenges the image of continuity the monarchy depends on. Which is why secrecy was never an option, it was a necessity. Let's not forget the financial and legal stakes. Surrogacy arrangements are complex. They involve payments, contracts, legal guardianship transfers. In the UK, Surrogacy is legal but highly regulated, and commercial arrangements are prohibited. If Meghan and Harry entered into such an agreement, they may have had to skirt legal gray areas. Perhaps the surrogate was compensated under the table. Perhaps paperwork was signed quietly, away from the eyes of regulators. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is why the palace and the Sussexes scrambled so hard to bury the evidence. Because exposure wouldn't just have caused scandal, it could have caused legal consequences. Now, imagine the surrogate herself. Was she proud? Was she afraid? Did she feel silenced? Did she watch the world celebrate Meghan's supposed labor and feel invisible? We may never know. Because her story, her identity, her voice were erased the moment Archie's photo was revealed. The NDAs ensured she'd never speak. The sealed files ensured she'd never be found. And Meghan stepped forward, glowing, as though nothing unusual had ever happened. But for the doctor, for the staff who witnessed the truth, the memory lingers. The surrogate was real. Her name was logged. Her presence undeniable. And the only way to protect the illusion was to remove Meghan's name entirely. So ask yourself this. If surrogacy was the path chosen, why not admit it? Why not embrace honesty, like so many others have? Because for Harry and Meghan, honesty was risk. Honesty meant questions about Archie's legitimacy. Honesty meant critics claiming Meghan had deceived the public all along. Honesty meant headlines they couldn't control. So instead, they chose illusion. They chose to rewrite the story. They chose to silence everyone who knew the truth. But illusions crack. Lies leak. And when they do, the damage is often worse than the truth itself. Because now, instead of admiration, there's suspicion. Instead of sympathy, there's betrayal. Instead of respect, there's scandal. And the surrogate arrangement wasn't just concealed, it was protected at all costs. Which is why hospital records weren't just sealed. They were allegedly altered, adjusted, manipulated to erase one woman's role and insert another's name into history. And that brings us to the most dangerous revelation of all. The alteration of medical records. A step so drastic, so unethical, that it crosses from secrecy into outright fraud. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Hospitals are temples of truth. Every admission, every note, every chart exists to preserve accuracy because people's lives and legacies depend on it. And yet, in the case of Archie Harrison's supposed birth, those sacred records became something else entirely. They became tools of manipulation. Tools not for healing, but for rewriting history. Because according to the doctor who stepped forward, the records weren't just sealed. They were altered. Think about that for a moment. Medical records are meant to be untouchable. They are evidence. Legal, medical, historical evidence. To tamper with them isn't just unethical. It's illegal. It's fraud. It's a betrayal of trust on the deepest level. And yet, when it came to Archie's birth, staff were allegedly pressured to do just that. Let's start at the beginning. When a woman gives birth in a hospital, multiple layers of documentation are created. There's the admission form, filled out upon arrival. There are the labor and delivery notes, updated in real time. There are the nursing charts, the surgical records if needed, the discharge forms. All of it is logged, signed, and stored in the hospital system. For royals, the scrutiny is even greater. Copies are often made. Witnesses are present. Records are archived for history. So how is it possible that Meghan's name wasn't in the system? How is it possible that the trail of paperwork surrounding Archie's birth seemed fractured? The doctor suggests one chilling answer. The records were deliberately adjusted to support a false narrative. Imagine being a nurse told to erase a name. Imagine being an administrator instructed to change an entry. Imagine being a doctor asked to sign off on something you knew wasn't true. That's what staff allegedly faced the morning Archie was born. And the pressure didn't come lightly. Representatives for Harry and Meghan made it clear this was not a request. It was an order. Now pause and ask yourself, what does that say about the balance of power? When royals, whose wealth and influence stretch across institutions, lean on ordinary hospital staff, what chance do they have? Refusal meant risking their jobs, their licenses, their futures. Compliance meant betraying their ethics. And many, it seems, chose survival. The alterations themselves were subtle, but devastating. Names redacted, dates adjusted, notes streamlined. Details stripped away until the file read like a sanitized script instead of a medical document. Where Meghan's name should have appeared, silence. Where the Seagate's details once existed, erasure. What remained was a file that supported the official story, but concealed the truth. And that concealment was reinforced with locked cabinets and sealed digital files. Access was restricted to only the highest-ranking administrators, many of whom had also been pressured or convinced that silence was the only option. The result was a Frankenstein record, part truth, part fabrication, carefully crafted to withstand scrutiny, but never intended to reveal reality. Consider this. If everything had been above board, if Meghan had truly delivered Archie herself, the records would have been a source of pride. Doctors and nurses would have been lauded. The hospital would have basked in the glow of royal association. Instead, they retreated into silence, offering no statements, no celebration, no transparency. Why? Because the records didn't support the narrative. They contradicted it. And so, they had to be rewritten. Now let's examine the implications. Altering medical records is not just a breach of ethics, it's a crime. It undermines trust in healthcare. It endangers lives. And in this case, it distorted the history of the monarchy itself. If a surrogate was indeed the one who gave birth, then Archie's true birth story was buried under false paperwork. His origin, his identity, was rewritten before he was even presented to the world. And here's where the deception deepens. Because the altered records didn't just hide the surrogate. They propped up Meghan's performance. Every note removed was another piece of evidence shielding her illusion of pregnancy. Every line erased was another reinforcement of the lie shown to cameras. The medical truth and the public narrative were at war, and the narrative won. But deception leaves traces. Doctors and nurses noticed discrepancies. Staff whispered about missing details. Even years later, the memory of being told to fix the records lingers like a scar. Some spoke of their guilt. Others admitted their fear. All knew they had been part of something far bigger than themselves, something that would one day explode. And it has. Because the doctor who revealed the missing admission now also suggests that the altered records point to a larger conspiracy. Not just silence. Not just secrecy. Active manipulation. The rewriting of reality itself. Now ask yourself, why take such a dangerous step? Why risk exposure, scandal, even prosecution, just to conceal a birth? The answer lies in power. Meghan and Harry's brand depended on the image of her as a mother. Their legacy depended on Archie's legitimacy. And the monarchy's stability depended on avoiding scandal. Together, those forces created a pressure so immense that altering records seemed like the lesser evil. But secrets rot. And when they rot, they reek. The altered records are no longer hidden. They're whispered about, questioned, doubted. And each new revelation makes the official story harder to believe. Which brings us to the heart of the matter. The alterations weren't done in isolation. They weren't the product of rogue staff or careless mistakes. They were orchestrated, directed, enforced by those closest to Harry and Meghan. The couple themselves may not have typed a word into the system, but their pressure, their demands, their obsession with control made it happen. And once you understand that, you see the full picture. A surrogate hidden, Meghan's name erased, the truth altered, and staff coerced into complicity. This wasn't just secrecy, it was fraud. But if Meghan's name was erased, if records were falsified, if staff were pressured into silence, what happens to those who refused? What happens to the ones who said no? Because not everyone complied. Some resisted. Some questioned. Some refused to play a part in the cover-up. And that's when the story takes an even darker turn. Because for those who didn't bend, threats began to follow. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine being a nurse, a midwife, or a junior administrator on duty the morning of May 6, 2019. You're proud to be working at Portland Hospital, aware that history is unfolding within its walls. You've trained for years to provide care with honesty and professionalism. And suddenly, you're told, directly or indirectly, that your job is no longer about medicine. It's about compliance. About playing a role in a story that doesn't add up. This is where Harry and Meghan's involvement becomes chilling. Because according to insiders, the pressure on staff didn't come from vague whispers or distant palisades. It came from the Sussexes themselves, or their closest representatives. bearing orders that brooked no resistance. Let's start with Meghan. By all accounts, she was obsessed with controlling her image. Every appearance, every photograph, every statement had to be curated. Pregnancy only heightened that control. Staff recall her being unusually firm, even combative, about what could and couldn't be shared. Words like privacy and boundaries were her shield, but in this context, they became weapons. Those words weren't about dignity. They were about censorship.